Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 45 of SCOTONOMICS. We continue our journey to find out exactly how the real economy works, all the while providing nourishment for independent minds. I haven't been able to do this for a while because Kieran's been so busy, but I'd like to introduce you all to my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
Hello, William. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be back. And also, I really like our new introductory tune. It's fantastic.
Excellent. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have you with me. The interview we've got today, Kieran was unavailable for that one, so it's a little bit more of me, but Kieran's going to join us at the end to talk about our interview with Stuart Mackintosh. Kieran, I take it last week was dominated by the big news in the UK?
Yeah, big news in the UK. Of course, we have both a new Prime Minister and a new monarch now. So it's all change here in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a little bit of not as much news coverage as you've had in the UK by all accounts, but it was big news all over Europe, as I'm sure everyone can imagine. And a chap when I was in having my lunch on Wednesday, was it Wednesday or was it Thursday? Queen
Thursday.
died.
Yeah, she died on
Thursday.
Thursday. Yeah.
He kind of dropped his knife and fork and said to me, "Has the Queen died? Oh my God!" So big news everywhere. Not quite to the extent in the UK. Anything else you've been up to the past week or so?
Yes, well, just being busy as a councillor. So a couple of big committees last week. So yeah, really busy with all that kind of stuff. So yeah. And then of course all these big events, so that of course as a councillor you have to attend various things. So yeah, I was up at 6 a.m. yesterday to watch the funeral cortege pass by us in Aberdeen, because obviously the Queen died in Balmoral, which is in Aberdeenshire, in beautiful Aberdeenshire. So the cortege left Balmoral and came all the way through Aberdeen, Dundee, and then on to Edinburgh.
Ah, okay. Wow, a big trip then. I've missed most of this, and I'm sure there's some people who are really jealous of that and been able to watch other things over here in Barcelona. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the interview tonight. We're really lucky to be able to call occasionally on Stuart Mackintosh to give us an update on what's been happening in the States. I mean, he's a really well-connected, really knowledgeable person within American kind of corridors of power. So we're really lucky to get him. We had a fascinating conversation with him, and we covered a lot, but we were mainly talking about Biden and the new bills, and including the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's what we're going to cover. It's a really great interview. I hope you can stay with us. Thanks everyone who's joining us live on Facebook, Twitter, and also on YouTube. The interview is about 40 minutes, and then Kieran and I will be back after Kieran cycles home from work to have a little conversation with you. But please do comment. It'd be great to hear your thoughts great to see your thoughts in the comments. Enjoy the interview. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Hello, Stuart. Nice to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS.
It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's going to be really interesting for us because you're going to give us a really good overview of what's been happening in the States over summer as we lead up to the really important midterm elections. The first thing I wanted to get a little bit of a handle on was this new and seismic bill that's been passed in the States by Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act. And my first question is, what is it? And then second, just to that, is why is it called the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is an incredibly important piece of legislation. It came out of negotiations after Senator Manchin from West Virginia announced on July 15th that he was not going to support the climate change goals of the Biden administration, that he'd had enough, he wasn't going to do it anymore. And no more negotiations, it was over. And everybody despaired. I'm sure many people in Scotland despaired when we saw that basically Biden's climate plans were destroyed by Manchin. But negotiations continued behind closed doors, led by Senator Schumer, who's the Democratic leader in the Senate. And they managed to push through and come to this deal, which is a over $700 billion deal called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's about 50% cuts in Medicare prices, restraints on prices. It's also an increase in corporate taxes to 15% minimum. It's other deficit reduction actions. So about 50% of that is reduction of deficits, new taxes. Then 50% is the largest single investment in climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and transformation in the history of America. So it's very significant. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, really as a nod towards Manchin and to a lesser degree Senator Sinema, because it will cut some prices. It's paying off the deficit, and it signals to his voters and to him that this is really also about kind of quote unquote balancing the books. So it is a bit confusing. This is not this bill is not really about inflation reduction as such, but what it does is it sends a signal that chimes well with certain voters, and particularly with Senator Manchin. So if the price of passing a bill worth more than $700 billion is a slightly confusing name that obscures the climate change goal, I'm happy with it. This is perhaps smaller than Biden wanted in the outset of the very beginning of his administration, but it is the largest package of climate change related commitments in the history of America, and it really does change the calculus.
Let's focus on the climate. This was held up by the senator, who was a Democrat senator, wasn't he? Who held this? Was it, your name again was Manchin?
Manchin. He's a Democrat from West Virginia, which is a deep Trump supporting state. So he has to he has a difficult line to thread. Of course, the Senate is split 50-50 with the deciding vote cast by the vice president, but it's only 50-50 if you get Manchin's vote. And so he was absolutely pivotal. Without Manchin, you didn't have a deal.
I think he's got some has he got quite big investments in coal?
Yes, he does. I mean, there was a
personal aspect to that as well, wasn't there? There wasn't just a representing his electorate.
And that's right. I've argued in the past that had he really wanted to represent his electorate, he could have got a deal that basically paid his miners to do something else, paid them large, redundancy packages, retrained them, and provided that new job option at a cost of $5 or $6 billion, all of which could be within the scope of that kind of bill. None of which was done by Manchin because he's not really, in my view, representing his core voters' economic perspectives, more their sort of political opposition to Biden, really.
Great. Well, and when we're looking at these bills, they tend to, what you want to see is that they address the supply side, but they also address the demand side. Yes. So the supply is very much how are we getting these yes. resources, how are they getting into the economy? So there's that, and then there's the other side that says, hey, what are we doing to lessen the amount of resources that we're using? So if you look at those two things that you hope to see in any balanced approach towards reducing the impact that we have on the climate, what does the bill do in those two areas?
Well, if you take the supply side, this is actually a well-crafted bill, and attempts to actually press those buttons, as you say, on supply and demand. On supply side, you've got incentives, multi-year incentives for wind and solar production. So that's the utility production. So support the transition there. You've got big incentives for carbon capture and sequestration. So that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions and locking them underground. You've got big incentives for manufacturing, clean manufacturing that is supportive of the transition. So that again is creating a different supply. But then on the demand side, you've got big incentives for EVs. So an average person, that is to say, well, most Americans, anyone earning under $150,000 a year, will get up to $7,500 in incentives when they buy their EV. And I should say, on the supply side of EV, if you're making those batteries in America, there are significant incentives there for the manufacturer, reducing the cost of those batteries by up to 35%. So if I'm Ford, I get 35% subsidy on my battery production. Well, if I'm a customer, I get $7,500 off my EV, which I purchased from Ford, which is built in by Ford in America using unionized laborers. So this is really an interesting dynamic, and it shows you, this is an instance, the EVs in particular, of effective and smart policymaking. And what's different, and I think significant and substantial and really important to understand, is this is the first instance for years and years, going way before Obama, of active industrial policy being pursued by a Democratic president. Because that's what industrial policy is, right? It's address supply, so create more batteries, create more production, aimed at the average person, which is also employing people, unionized workers, pay proper wages, and then create the demand by providing the credit at the other end. But there are other examples like that. The bill has lots of instances where they're trying to balance both. That's why analyses done after the IRA came out estimate that this should, once enacted, help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in America by 40% by 2050. Now, that's not the 50% that Biden committed to, but it's very significant considering that only a month ago, we thought the game was up and that America was careening into disaster. Oh, let me give you one example, a very important additional example of strategic action by the Senate. The Senate embedded in this bill, much to the anger of the Republicans in the Senate, a specific legal language that gives the Environmental Protection Agency the right to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. And why that's important is because the Supreme Court just last month
threw that out, didn't they?
Judged, and that was not possible. And they explicitly said, Congress must give the EPA the authority to do this. They don't have the authority. Well, as of this week, they do. So it's I'm more positive than I've been for some time, as you can tell from my tone about this.
In Scotland, the Scottish government is very positive about a just transition, and in all the documents it's talking about how we do this, and we can be successful and we can create all of these jobs, but it has so few levers. And I've always found that just a little bit concerning, that we're promising so much in terms of a just transition without actually having any of the main economic levers, as said, currency, trade, employment law, and energy. There's so many areas that aren't involved. Can you imagine how successful this would be in the States if you didn't have those policy levers?
Well, that's right. I mean, the argument that I make and that you're making is that in order to achieve these goals, and let's be also brutally frank, we're not going to restrain global temperatures and hold them below 1.5 or at 1.5 degrees above that of pre-industrial levels. Where the level of greenhouse gas production currently is too high. We're not pressing down fast enough. So we're going to pass through that. It's going to be a matter of grappling with how far past our own self-designated goals we get. But you're absolutely right. If you're for Scotland or for the United States, the only way you achieve these goals is by using all of those levers and having access to all of those levers. So it's designing an education policy that supports the kind of technologies and skills that you need for a green future. It's tax policies that incentivize it. It's incentive policies as well. It's regulation that restricts certain behaviors. It's all of those things put together. And your question, could we do it if we weren't using all these levers? Absolutely not. There's no corner solution to making the transition. And what was most worrying before the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed, was that we were essentially in danger of not having the necessary levers and be faced by a Supreme Court that was trying to stop policy change. in the matter of weeks, that has shifted to a much more positive dynamic, and it's exhibited by the reaction of major industrial leaders like the CEO of Vestas, which is one of the largest wind turbine producers in the world, who called this a game changer and a breakthrough, because it changes the strategic calculus for businesses. Businesses now know the regulatory future is headed this way for the next X number of years. These incentives will be in place. You know that from the UK in terms of the green transition there, and people putting solar on their roofs and so on. Those regulations, those feed-in tariffs, those incentives, they matter to the outcome.
Let's look at, because that's definitely the supply side. Is there anything in the bill that says to people, you have got to start driving less, you have got to start using more public transport, you have got to try and stop consuming as much, you've got to stop flying so much? Is there anything around this idea that, as an American libertarian would say, you're stopping people's freedom? Is there anything around that?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the demand side, they're trying to make it incentivize you to make these shifts. So they're providing the credits for your cars. They're providing money so that you can retrofit your house with new HVAC systems that are more energy efficient, and so on and so forth. There are many different types of programs like that. But in terms of the prohibition aspect, yes, I can't bamboozle you. Americans are very bad at that prohibition piece, or what I should say is the regulatory restraint. So it's clear that the Biden team have decided they're not going to win that on that, and that they put most of their eggs in the incentive basket, not in the regulatory restraint. On the consumer side, that is different in terms of the producer side. So, for instance, they passed new regulations on methane, part of which is in this bill, but also other regulation on methane to find producers that permit methane to escape in their production, and so on. There are other examples like that where, of course, they're using the regulatory power of the government to penalize or restrict firms from taking certain actions, but not to the extent that you would see in Europe, for instance. And ultimately, finally, we don't have a functioning carbon price yet. We've got an internal government price that they are using in their minds when they're considering issues. But in terms of properly functioning carbon markets and regulation and pricing, as you have in Europe, as you have in Britain, no, we don't.
Reducing emissions is really important. But unless we reduce consumption, that emission figure is likely not to have the impact that we want in terms of climate change. And, a lot of people are saying there's a focus on net zero, which has no correlation to resource use. And when you're looking at the climate, there's got to be something that says we have to stop using the amount of resources that we currently use. Is there anything in the bill that says we need to think about the kind of planetary boundaries? We need to think about our consumption, or is this just left completely aside?
Well, this is an incredibly good and important point. I mean, it's the macro question of we have a set carbon budget that we need to avoid blowing past. Shouldn't we be putting hard limits on that firm to firm and so on? Of course, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, can't do that, cannot do everything in that respect. And no doubt, when they were negotiating this, some things were left aside because if you're trying to get a deal with Manchin, you don't want to imply even tangentially that you're suggesting that people be restrained from doing what makes them happy as Americans. Having said that, everybody understands that there needs to be change, and many of these individual pieces will change and should continue to lower the carbon intensity of the American economy as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, clearly, you're going to have more efficient cars, more EVs. Do we yet have a date certain by which, the the internal combustion engine is not going to be manufactured in America? No, we don't. But I'm less concerned about that because I can see all of the major producers focusing on EVs now and moving quickly into that space. And in doing so, you'll see a reduction. Now, that's not quite the consumption piece, but the greater efficiency of these new production facilities and new technologies mean that you will see some reduction. As much as you would like to see, I'm not so sure. You know, America can't do, or is unwilling to do, the kind of things you would see in France, for instance, where they recently put a ban on short haul flights under a certain length because they're too expensive from a carbon perspective.
It's a big shift in what my perception is of this idea of freedom and liberty in the States. And I've just finished reading Jared Diamond's book Collapse, and he says looking at all the societies across the world that have collapsed, he said one of the key factors is that when they have a value, and one of their values, let's say Easter Island, one of the big values was the importance of religion, and that's why they had to cut down all the trees to build these structures, to put these stone edifices on. The values became more important than the clear logic. And I think when we're looking at the States, if this value is that you've got complete liberty and you can spend and you can consume what you want, if that value doesn't change, then all of these measures won't have anywhere near the impact that they have, because that's the most important thing. I think anyone who's interested in and scared about what's happening in the climate is to realize that they've got to reduce their carbon footprint and emissions, but it's a consumption of everything that has to come.
That message is essential, and it is being repeated in lots of circumstances. And I should add as well, remember that it's not just about what's in this bill and what is in these specific pieces of government legislation, which are predominantly incentive focused and less regulatory restraint focused. It's also about the general climate and the general dynamic in society as well. So if you've got more than a fifth of US companies now committed to net zero, and they're having to implement against that and strategize with that creates an internal dynamic to take restricting steps, right? So when I was talking to the general manager of Mitsubishi, which I used to work for, and they said that their CEO had announced that they were going to have this target, and they were going to also have target for 2030. And it means that every business unit in this company across the world, it now has to measure against those goals. How are they achieving it in their own context? If they're not achieving it, what are they going to do differently next year, and so on. So that's an example of where when we're thinking about this, and I'm saying this from a positive perspective, when we're thinking about can we change perspectives and force people to do things they don't want to do? Businesses are doing that and are beginning to do that. I think of European businesses that have their own carbon budgets and ask their staff, are you looking like you're going to overrun your carbon budget, in which case you can't do X?
There's a huge element of geopolitics in this as well, isn't there? That this is not just for a green transition. This is to secure America against any, let's say, for example, Chinese involvement in Taiwan and the semiconductors, and also a reliance on China for solar panels. What's the geopolitics behind this bill?
That's right. Geopolitical challenge and race, America versus China, is well underway. You can see the tensions over Taiwan. This bill incentivizes production in America and in North America and by allies, not to replace Chinese sources. In particular, the related chip bill, which is a separate bill but which you recognize, is very important, because what they've discovered, of course, as a result of the pandemic, was that too many of these chips were being produced in Taiwan, most of them, and not enough in the United States. And so Biden has signed a massive bill that incentivizes and changes the dynamic so that Intel and others will build huge chip manufacturing facilities in the US. I don't see that dynamic changing anytime soon. I don't agree with Steve Bannon on pretty much anything, But I do agree that, as he said in the Trump administration, that the single most important clash of the 21st century will be China versus the United States, and I think that is playing out as we see right now. It's more tense than it has been for a long time, but it will be maintained in the decades ahead, with periods of relative calm and then periods of more tension. But that competitive dynamic need not be entirely destructive of the common green goals, because the Chinese understand that they need to win this race to the green transition and the green technologies of tomorrow, and that's why they've been buying all of these rare earth sources, and that's why they're producing solar and wind and other technologies at such a rate. America needs to catch up. America has to have its own sources as well. So the net effect of those two dynamics needn't be entirely destructive, but we do have to bear those in mind for sure.
We've been quite upbeat about this bill. How is this going to affect Biden, the Democrats, as we lead into the midterms, which I think are just in a few months' time in November?
Yeah, it's changing. It's changing the political landscape. As I said, this bill is very significant, historic. And then when you line it up and you look at the totality of Biden bills in the first 2 years, you had a $1.9 trillion pandemic relief bill at the outset. You had a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, the largest infrastructure bill again ever signed in American history. You had your chip bill that we just been discussing, and then you have this bill, which is 700 and some billion. So that means, all told, you're really talking about legislation involving nearly 4 trillion. And as I say, what, a trillion here, a trillion there, pretty soon you're talking real money. But I'm being flippant, but the net effect of all of those things, and of the reducing gasoline prices in America, because if anything upsets Americans more, I don't know what it is, than higher gas prices. And gas prices got to $5 a gallon, which is peanuts by, of course, UK standards, but by American standards, people's hair were on fire. Now they've reduced significantly because supply constraints have been relieved somewhat, and because the Chinese economy is slowing, so demand in China has slowed. So we've got a relief there. You've got these very significant bills that are changing the sort of overall tone. People are seeing some positive dynamics, and then you have additional steps that are also very popular. So this week, Biden announced signature of a provision that will make the purchase of hearing aids much cheaper in America, which affects about 30 million Americans. So that's a positive. And today, I understand he's going to make another announcement which will address student loan debt forgiveness, which will affect millions of Americans. It's almost like he's playing politics, with his economic levers. But as a result of that, when the recent poll that came out this week on, how do you feel the economy is going? How do you feel the direction of the United States is going? It's shifted. People are about 7 percentage points more positive than they were last month. And that dynamic, connected with backlash against what the Supreme Court is doing with a woman's right to control their own body and make their own decisions, is shifting the possibilities in November. So it's now more likely than not that the Democrats will hold the Senate and may take up a few additional seats and beat the Republicans in a few key areas, because their candidates are outperforming the Trump-supported candidates. Will they be able to hold the line in the House? Very much less likely, but it won't be a slaughter that they expected it to be only a couple of months ago. So we'll still have a split Congress, but we won't have a Republican Congress, an entirely Republican Congress, opposing everything that Biden is trying to do.
So let's step away from the States, and as you'll be aware that in the UK at the moment we are about to welcome, probably not the right word, we're about to welcome a new Prime Minister. Famously, Biden did not get on with Boris Johnson What do you think his relationship's going to be like with trust?
It's still going to be strained. Let's face it, Biden's natural proclivity is leaning towards Europe in support of the Irish government, and certainly in support of the protocol and the maintenance of the deal that Boris struck over Brexit and the Irish border, and then tried to dismantle. Biden made it very clear that he was not going to put up with that. If there was any steps like that, the Americans would take a very dim view of it. And he also said, we're not going to do a free trade agreement with the UK right now. It's off the table given what's going on. I don't expect that UK FTA to suddenly reappear. It's not high on his agenda. Trade is not central to his goals at the moment. He's focused on domestic issues. And part of that has resulted in a shift in the UK, which you're probably aware of, where the UK trade authorities, trusts and others have been pushing for free trade or trade facilitation agreements with individual US states, which is peculiar. A colleague of mine who works in this field for the US government confessed to me that they saw this deal with Indiana and they thought it was a typo. Oh, is this a deal with India? No, Indiana? I mean, the reality is states in America, of course, don't control customs, don't control tariffs, can't control the interstate regulation of trade. So
these are probably deals where we'll promote some Indiana businesses if you promote some British businesses, but there's nothing meaningful in terms of trade relations happening.
There's nothing meaningful, so I don't see that likely changing. And I definitely feel in America still a sort of overall shock. We're still shocked, if I wear my American hat, about what the UK has managed to do to itself in terms of the recent decisions in the last few years. Trade with America can never substitute for trade with Europe, for Britain and for Scotland. We know that, you know that. Unfortunately, the reality of cutting off your main trading partners as part of Brexit, those extremely costly decisions are coming home to roost. Yeah. I wasn't making a judgment on the situation of the Scottish government and economy once you're independent. Everybody assumes rightly that Scotland would re-enter the European Union relatively smoothly and swiftly. The negotiations take some time, but they won't be endless. And yeah, you will get full access, as you should and as you want, and that will create a positive economic dynamic for Scotland, no doubt, and help heal some of the wounds, the self-inflicted wounds that we see being opened by Brexit. Absolutely.
It's interesting. I found a stat just last week that Ireland now does more trade with the States than it does with the United Kingdom.
Oh my goodness.
So it used to do about 70-80% of trade with the UK, and it's now I think it's in about 18 with the UK. So things change, and over decades, things can change substantially. Let's look a little bit wider then. With everything that's happening in the States in terms of these bills that Biden's been passing, but also the impact of inflation, which I think is around about 8% at the moment in the US. And bizarrely, the US, you can, representing some central bankers, you can maybe explain this to me, but the US is technically in a recession, but I think the Fed have said, oh no, we're not in recession. What is happening in the States? Do you think the States is in recession right now? And what's likely to happen? Can you look 6 months for the global economy, look ahead for us?
In the US, there's an organization called the NBER, and they determine from an academic perspective whether or not the US is in recession. They look back, usually 2 or 3 quarters hence, and they say, well, were we in a recession then? And if they see 2 side-by-side contractions, then they announce only after the event, some time after the event, that it was in a recession. So maybe Biden's technically correct, but more to the point, are we in a recession now? a poll released by the National Association of Business Economists, which I used to be president of yesterday, showed about 20% of US economists think we are in a recession, but about 75% think we are not in a recession yet, and that we will get into a recession middle of next year. So there's an assumption, yeah, we will have a downturn. We perhaps are not in it yet. Certainly, there are there's some worries about increasing rents, repossession of rent of leased cars, and so on and so forth. But the numbers haven't quite shown up yet. And if it is a recession, it's a slightly different recession. We have 2 million unfilled jobs. People's wages are rising, although not as fast as inflation. This is a slightly different recession, of course, because of the dynamics of post-pandemic recovery. I don't think that the central bank under Jay Powell can correct matters and restrain inflation without a period of recession. Historically, that's almost never occurred. When the Fed has to stamp down inflation, rates have to rise, the economy must slow, and that means that you're going to go into a period of recession. 9 months, 12 months at most. I doubt longer than that. The chair still thinks he can do it, that we can have a soft landing and no recession. I doubt it.
Yeah, there's not many people who agree.
The green transition may heat the economy to a degree that means that you may run a slightly higher inflation rate over the longer term, at least for some time while you're retooling the economy, right? Because there's going to be huge demand for new technologies, new skills. The skills aren't being supplied fast enough. But the demand continues to heat up, and so on and so forth. So maybe you run inflation higher than 2%. Let's remember also that 2%, this mythical 2% that we're all aiming for, was just plucked out of thin air by the central bankers. There's no specific, model or construct that says 2% is the right percentage, any other percentage is wrong. That's not the case. And in fact, you would have seen Paul Krugman and other people saying as much in the long moderation when we were having difficulty getting to 2%. They said, well, why don't we say aim for 2% on average? And that's where we are now. But they were really saying, let's allow a certain overshoot. But having said that, of course, I don't agree entirely with this notion that we're in a very, very stop-go-ish circumstance at the moment, because of course the Fed has been criticized for waiting too long. The Fed waited and waited because they didn't want to be hasty in raising rates, and in doing so, many people feel like they allowed the rates to get away, the interest rate to get away from inflation rate, to get away from them, and therefore having to tamp down harder. Now, are we going to have more fluctuation in inflation in the future? That depends on numerous factors, not least green transition, but also the perception of consumers. Do they believe that inflation is about to rise for the long term? In America, not yet. In America, they still have relatively tapped down inflation expectations. In Europe will be affected negatively by the current disasters that are being inflicted by high temperatures. For instance, with Germany going into recession, so that will change the dynamic internally in Germany and in Europe, and therefore ought to, if anything, help partially solve the inflation problem in Europe. But you're right that if you've got inflation problems like in Britain that are being driven by predominantly external factors, then interest rates will not really help you so much, because your interest rates don't control for gas prices, gas prices or oil prices, and that and the central bank simply has no control over those at all.
Yeah, I think that's my main concern, is that I don't think it's the best lever at the best of times. Interest rates, because it does push people into unemployment, and it can cause a recession. But it's certainly the worst tool at the worst time when you're using it for short-term inflationary.
That's right.
There's fiscal measures that you could be using to make that impact on inflation. You know, let's say dividend caps, for example. You know, things that actually substantially make a difference in the economy.
I agree, and I mean, you said it already in earlier remarks, and I'm on the radical end of my American colleagues, because I agree. You use interest rates where you can. It's a blunt instrument. It can, you know, increases the cost of housing and so on and so forth. It tamps down demand in certain areas. But you ought to, if you've got an energy supply and price hike, you definitely should be you should definitely be using profit taxes to cream off the top and solve for the pain at the bottom. You should be taking other measures as governments and not as the central bank, because again, there was a long period, far too long, where in America, but also in Europe, there was a feeling like the central bank were the people that should solve for all the problems. Central banks can't solve for many of these problems. As you say, they have a blunt instrument. They only really have one, and then they have a secondary regulatory instrument. But again, that's not really an effective instrument in the short term. It can affect borrowing and so on, but it's not a very sharp instrument for short-term action. What matters is the combination of those steps and many other steps which can be taken by governments to address the economy, but also you know, the various flows in and out of the economy, which the central bank simply cannot do.
It was very easy for governments to say that the central banks could do all this because it took the pressure off them, and then when they didn't, they had someone to blame. I mean, that's just Christmas and New Year coming at once, isn't it, for a government? I mean, I don't know if you saw Liz's Truss comment from just last week, that her idea of redistribution in taxing someone or a business or an industry that's done well, to give that to people who have not had any of those similar situations or luck. The redistributive nature of any government, any economy using taxation, she regards that as handouts. So that's her view of redistribution, is that that's a handout, and she's completely against handouts. So we've got someone who's more Thatcherite than Thatcher. And I personally think that if Brexit and Boris Johnson over the last couple of years has put us on any kind of course, then you've now got someone who's just pushing the throttle down on that course. And I think it's a hugely dangerous position for the United Kingdom to be in as we move into a period when we have to be spending and we have to be investing to avoid a climate crisis. It's the wrong person at absolutely the wrong time. And there's been hardly any mention of the climate in any of the debates between Sunak and Truss, apart from things like there's too many solar panels on land, and we need to get rid of these green taxes and bills. You know, it's an argument, it's conversations that you'd have been having a decade ago. They are still mainstream in the UK.
It's disappointing to hear that, and it contrasts for the first time for a long time. You know, in America, where people feel like, wow, this was what's happened over the last couple of weeks here on climate change. It's a tipping point in terms of policy. It changes the outcomes potentially, changes the incentive structures. It changes how people are thinking. I mean, people in America are definitely thinking about the climate. I mean, it's not their predominant, overwhelming focus, but are they looking at the searing heat and experiencing the searing heat? Can they see the fires in California? Yes. Are they seeing the reports about Germany, the Rhine, or the Yangtze in China? Some of them certainly are. And they're adding those two things together, and they recognize they want action. They want to see that happen. Young voters increasingly definitely do that. They want to see action on these steps. And so we're in a position where perhaps we can see some positive dynamics. And it's unfortunate, as you described, the UK going in the wrong direction right now.
It's great to see that the States are starting to move on that trajectory to really understanding the amount of money, investment, and time you have to put into making a green transition. I hope that can be some inspiration for the United Kingdom, not just in Westminster, but also in Holyrood. Stuart, thanks so much for joining us in Scotonomics. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks. So that was a tour de force, really, of what's going on in the States and the impact on the global economy. So thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, William, and thank you to your viewers. Look forward to seeing you again.
Bye for now. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. As I said, we're so lucky to be able to get Stuart to come on. I also pulled up a little quote from the Financial Times. One of the, the author of that article was Claudia Sam, who is also one of the really well-known American economist who speaks about the Fed, and Claudia has spoken for us before, and she's keen to come on and speak again. And as we know, what happens in the States has a huge impact on the UK and the global economy. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Kieran's not managed to make it home on her bicycle, so I don't think she'll be joining us for the end of the show. We've had some really good comments and questions, and all I really wanted to highlight was how many things are we seeing, the kind of common narrative of our episodes around this idea that the central banks are raising interest rate. It's not having any impact on inflation, but people are feeling the pain of these interest rate rises, and the wealthy are getting wealthier because they're being paid more money on their savings. So it's a real strong theme that's coming across our interviews. And also, I'm sure you've noticed our theme on the green economy and what we have to do with the climate. So Stuart is really positive, and he's a real positive force in America on the need for the American economy to decarbonize and become much better for the environment. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. Next week, we've not quite decided what we're going to cover, but we'll let you know, and we'll be back here a week on Monday. Thanks for joining us, and bye for now.